Sonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are back with another aftermarket RTX card. This one is actually from Gigabyte and it's the Aorus RTX 2080 Xtreme 8G. You may remember way back in September when RTX was just launched, our first aftermarket card was actually also from Gigabyte, and that was the Gaming OC 2080 model. That was essentially a triple fan cooler slapped on top of a reference PCB, whereas this Aorus card is very much a custom card, lots of extra features to talk about, and it also comes factory overclocked to 1890 MHz, while incidentally the memory is actually the first card we've seen with factory overclocked memory, as this one has been bumped up by an extra 140 MHz. We're going to dive straight in with a look at the design though, and the first thing is, I really have to say this is a big card. It actually measures 290 by 134 by 59.9 millimeters, so it's certainly not small and it's effectively a triple slot card. Given that it also weighs over 1.3 kilograms, it's actually quite fitting that Gigabyte has included this little stand in the box. This is essentially a GPU support bracket. You slot this in your case and it will keep the graphics card from sagging by just resting on the edge here. So this can actually be adjusted in size. You can see in my case I have a PSU shroud, so I only need it very short to hold up the card. It's not the best looking solution, but again, considering it's such a heavy card, it will just prevent any extra strain on your PCI-E slot, so I do think it is a feature worth including. Moving back to the card though, the shroud is mostly made of matte black plastic. There is some metal sections on the front, although that seems to be only for appearance's sake, and you can see that where it just kind of crosses over on top of the three fans. Speaking of those fans, each of these measure 100 millimeters in diameter, which I think is quite impressive to get 300 millimeter fans on one card. Gigabyte has had to make a little sacrifice though, in that the central fan, its fan blades are much thinner, just so there's no unwanted contact between the outer two fans and that central fan. And it's also interesting that that middle fan actually spins in reverse, so the opposite direction to the two outer fans. Gigabyte says this is actually to reduce turbulence and thus help thermal transfer, but we're going to get to thermals later on in the review. While we're on the topic of the fans though, these actually form quite an important part of the card's overall RGB lighting, and I have to say it actually looks really cool. Essentially, each fan, one single fan blade has one LED positioned on each fan, although there are some LEDs behind the central hub. But because there's one LED positioned on the outer edge of each fan blade, when the fan spins, it actually looks like it's got this LED ring. So you can see it here, it actually looks really cool. You can see it spinning around and it looks like there's a ring going around the outer edge of the fans, even though it's just one LED. You can of course choose your own custom effects using RGB Fusion as well, and there's also the Aorus logo on the side of the card, as well as the Aorus logo on the backplate, which also act as other RGB zones. Also on that front edge, just next to the Aorus RGB logo, we do find some GeForce RTX branding, although this is not illuminated. But if we flip the card over, we get a proper look at the backplate. This is made from anodized aluminium, and I have to say it both looks and feels really good, even if it is a bit of a fingerprint magnet. You can also see, as we already mentioned, on the right hand side along the edge, you can see the Aorus logo, which as we mentioned is one of the RGB zones, but there's no other branding or logos on the back of the card. If we keep moving down that front side of the card though, we will also see that the power requirements are two 8-pin PCI-E power connectors, and overall that is pretty standard for a factory overclocked RTX 2080 like this Aorus Xtreme model. What is not standard though is actually the display outputs. That's because there's a total of 7 display outputs on this Aorus Xtreme, when typically we'd only see 5 on a regular card. Now, you can only use up to 5 of these display outputs, but essentially it gives you a bit more flexibility. The way this works is, if we look at the I/O bracket, we can essentially divide it in two. So on the right hand side, we've got a single HDMI, a single DisplayPort, and a single USB-C. These 3 ports are always active, so you'll always be able to use these 3 ports. On the left hand side though, we can see there's a pair of DisplayPorts and there's a pair of HDMI ports. You can only choose one of these pairs. So essentially what that means is, when choosing your display outputs, you can either have 3 DisplayPorts, 1 HDMI and 1 USB-C, or you can have 3 HDMI, 1 DisplayPort and 1 USB-C. So like I said, it's just meant to give you a bit more flexibility when it comes to choosing what monitors you want to connect to the graphics card. Moving on now to open up the card, this requires the removal of 10 screws from the back, and then we can get a look at the custom PCB. The main thing here for me really is the absolutely whopping 12+2 power phase design. Founders Edition 2080 only has an 8+2 power phase design, for instance, so clearly Aorus has gone all out and they say this is for extreme overclocking, although we will touch on manual overclocking later in the review. We can also see that the memory comes from Micron, 8GB of GDDR6, and the GPU die as well is labelled TU104-400A, and as we know, the A signifies that this is a bin chip that can be sold with a factory overclock. In terms of the heatsink, this is a very hefty unit. It actually weighs over 900 grams, and it utilises no less than 7 copper heat pipes, each of which look like they measure 6mm in diameter. Interestingly though, these actually make direct contact with the GPU die rather than using a cold plate, although there are 2 separate cold plates, one for the VRAM chips and one for the VRM, and you'll also see plenty of thermal pads there as well. Now it's time to move on to performance, and the first thing I'll say is we're going to show you 4K benchmarks. So if you are looking for 1080p or 1440p charts, you can find those along with our full testing methodology over on kitguru.net. So with the charts now up, it is no surprise to see this Aorus Xtreme performing up there with the fastest aftermarket 2080s we have tested so far, which as I mentioned is not a surprise considering its very fast factory overclock of 1890 MHz. There is some performance variation from game to game, although if we are to draw a rough trend we can see it is typically faster than the Palette GameRock Premium 2080 and just slower than the Asus ROG Strix 2080, but even then the margins between this Aorus and the Asus ROG Strix card is at most 0.6 FPS at 4K, so clearly the margins are very small between these factory overclocked 2080s. Taking a look at average clock speed, we can see why this trend was occurring. This Aorus card actually averaged 1932 MHz out of the box, which is 5 MHz faster than the Palette GameRock Premium, so hardly anything, and it's about 31 MHz slower than the Asus ROG Strix card, and that just goes to explain why we saw this Aorus card kind of slot in just ahead of the Palette, but just behind the Asus ROG Strix model. This next section gets very interesting though, as we are talking about temperatures. This Aorus card actually peaked at 75 degrees on the GPU core, and while that is not a dangerously hot temperature, it's still well below the maximum operating temperature for an RTX 2080. It is definitely a lot hotter than I thought this card would run. Considering it is such a big card with a triple fan cooler, I was certainly expecting this card maybe to run in the low 60s, because it's actually running the same temperature as NVIDIA's Founders Edition and a full 10 degrees hotter than Gigabyte's own RTX 2080 gaming OC that we mentioned at the beginning of the review. That card only peaked at 65C. So despite that being a smaller card with smaller fans as well, it peaks a full 10C cooler than this Aorus card, and I have to say I really don't understand why that is happening. It's not like it's an especially quiet card either, as it's actually quite loud. It peaked at 47 decibels, which makes it the loudest aftermarket RTX card we have tested so far. It's a full 5 decibels louder than NVIDIA's Founders Edition 2080, and it's almost 7 decibels louder than that gaming OC from Gigabyte that we already mentioned. I have to say, I really don't understand why this card is running so loud, as when I already said, it's got such a big heatsink, it's got 3 large 100mm fans. I don't get why this is peaking at 47 decibels. I actually thought something was wrong with the card. We got in touch with Gigabyte to discuss our findings, but their own internal testing essentially confirmed our figures, so it's not like there's actually anything wrong with it. It just turns out it is almost 7 decibels louder and 10 degrees hotter than Gigabyte's own gaming OC 2080. Moving on to power consumption now though, just a reminder, we do have dedicated sensors in the PCI-E slot as well as in the PCI-E power connectors, and that lets us measure power draw for the graphics card only, so the figures you're about to see are for the graphics card only and not for the system as a whole. With that being said though, we can see this card drew about 264 watts under load, which makes it almost identical to the Asus ROG Strix model, and it's essentially par for the course for a factory overclocked RTX 2080 like this. Moving on now to manual overclocking, I have to say there really isn't much headroom considering this card is already overclocked 1890 MHz. That is a full 180 MHz faster than reference 2080. I could only add an extra 70 MHz on top of that, although I was able to add an extra 780 MHz to the GDDR6 memory. This really didn't bring much in terms of a performance benefit though. We saw an extra 1000 points in Firestrike, which turned out to be the biggest performance increase, although in games we only saw between an extra 1 and 2 FPS while playing Deus Ex Mankind Divided and Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K resolution. Noise levels also rose up to almost 49 decibels, and we can also see that the GPU core ran 2 degrees hotter than at stock, and power consumption actually jumped up to almost 300 watts. So in total, for those small performance gains that we saw, I really don't think that this manual overclock is worth it. Wrapping up this review, I have to say that the Aorus RTX 2080 is a bit of a funny card. In its favour, it is quite fast. It's factory overclocked to 1890 MHz, which puts it up there with the fastest RTX 2080s we've seen so far. And I also quite like the RGB implementation, and you also get the added bonus of the extra display outputs. The thing I can't quite get my head around though is just the noise and the temperatures. Gigabyte's own RTX 2080 gaming OC is both 10 degrees cooler and almost 7 decibels quieter, as we already mentioned, and that card actually costs £120 less than this Aorus model. Yes, the Aorus card is faster, but even then, at most, the difference between the fastest and the slowest RTX 2080 cards is at best, 2 or 3 FPS. So I really don't think that's worth both the extra £120 as well as the added noise and the added heat. So for me, this really does make this card quite hard to recommend. It is fast, yes, and it does have some good features, but I really don't think you would pay more money for this Aorus card considering it is both hotter and louder than Gigabyte's own RTX 2080 gaming OC. So I'm Dominic for KitGuru. This has been our review of the Aorus RTX 2080 Xtreme 8G. Do let us know in the comments what you think. What do you think of the thermals and the noise levels? Is it really worth the extra £120 over the gaming OC? You can also subscribe and hit that notification bell. We do have lots more aftermarket RTX cards coming. We've got 2070s, 2080s and 2080 Ti's, so make sure you stick around for those. But until then, I will see you in the next video.